Good evening, everyone. I'm Dolores Donnelly, Community Development Officer with Armagh City, Banbridge and Craigavon Borough Council. Welcome to this evening's lecture, which will be delivered by our guest speaker, Dr. Alan Fernihough. Alan's subject tonight will be Mind Your Language, the decline of the Irish language in the 19th century. Also accompanying us is Dr. Gerard McAtasney, a local historian and author from Lurgan. Just want to comment that this evening's lecture has been made available through Council's Good Relations Programme, which is part financed by the Executive Office of Northern Ireland. Alan, if you'd like to start your talk whenever you're ready.
Yes, thank you very much, Dolores. This is a paper that is part of joint work I'm doing with my colleague Chris Colvin and my other co-author Owen McLaughlin, who's based over in Heriot-Watt in Scotland. And the idea is to understand why the Irish language fell so precipitously in the 19th century. Dolores mentioned before we started recording that her Irish is not of the fluent standard, and I'm very much the same. I studied Irish from the age of 5 to 18, and I basically can't hold a conversation today, which is astonishing that I was in education, full-time education, studying language for that length of time, and still hasn't rubbed off on me the same way in lots of other countries they happily have bilingualism where people are comfortable switching between languages because they're engaged in full-time education. So this paper,
Alan,
sorry,
can I interrupt you? Apologies, because I know a lot of people listening are probably thinking, how? Why has this happened? Now, and there can be a lot of explanations, and a lot of people have different opinions because, I do think a certain amount of comes down to the quality of the teaching at primary school.
Yeah.
And if you get a good foundation at primary school level, you're kind of on to a winner. You
Absolutely,
can create a love for the language at primary school, you're on to the winner.
Yeah.
If you kind of if that opening is lost, my feeling would be if that opening is lost, actually the Irish language for a lot, I can't speak for everybody, but for a lot of people, it became a real chore. It was a struggle.
Yeah, well, I'm not blaming teachers by any share. I mean, it's on me really why I didn't my Irish didn't develop. It's just
what I can say actually in my case, I had poor teaching for a number of years at primary school. And that in itself. So it was a struggle. Irish became a struggle for me. So my priority was simply trying to pass the exams and nothing more. And when a subject is a struggle, which is a shame, because then when it came to the later years of my secondary level education, I started to really recognize, God, it'd be lovely to have more of this. But at that stage, nearly it was kind of too late
in the game. Other priorities as well.
With other priorities, you know.
You need to get the points for the other subjects.
So it's also exposure. And I do think, though, thankfully today, there is a lot more avenues for exposure to the Irish language, especially now when you have like TG Cahir, which is an all-Irish TV channel and it does fantastic productions in the Irish language and everything. So that in itself helps a lot.
There are still threats, and Irish is not unique. For instance, in Iceland, they're very worried about the Icelandic language. And the reason is that teenagers prefer to speak in English simply because they're watching US TV shows, they're watching YouTubers, and it's all through the medium of English. And very often, Icelandic teenagers will speak in English to each other in preference to their own native language. But the paper that I'm looking at here and its relationship with the famine is that when Irish was declining in the 19th century, this overlaps with the famine period. It also overlaps with several other big historical secular changes in Ireland. What previous research has done is either one or two things. On one hand, we have Gareth Fitzgerald's work on the Irish language. He's the former Taoiseach. And he had a paper published which actually overlaps in the 80s with his time in office as the Irish Taoiseach / Prime Minister. And that was to use historical census records to chart the where and when of Irish language decline in the 19th century. So he assiduously studied this, and he was able to kind of map in Irish loss in a way we're able to do. The other research or historical focus on the Irish language in the 19th century has tried to qualitatively describe and understand the roots of the language loss. So what are the factors underpinning language loss? Is it the famine? Is it the emergence of the national schooling system? Is it depopulation more generally? Is it the massive changes that we see elsewhere, for instance, railways and so on? So Ireland in the 19th century is it's radically changing. And what factors are underpinning language loss? Well, historians have proposed and a few. But what we do and what motivates this whole area of research we have, is to try and join those two things together, to bring the qualitative element of mapping the spatial decline of the Irish language with measures and statistics on historical changes. So in our data, we get to see different communities and the degree to which national schooling is important. We also see the degree to which population is lost during the famine. Finally, we also see how much they get connected by the introduction of railways and so on. So we're going to be able to kind of marry these two things together and model it, which we do statistically. I'm not going to get too much into statistical details, but we'll be able to rank and assign weights to what are the most important factors that help explain language loss. But before I'll get into the specifics of the Irish language in good time. But before I do, I wanted to just zoom out of the Irish language question and say, well, why would someone who's interested in economic history be interested in language loss? And the reason for that is that there seems to be, if we don't focus on Ireland, we just focus around countries around the world, a kind of steady relationship that connects linguistic diversity in a country and the level of economic prosperity that country has. And countries that have more linguistic diversity, i.e. people speaking more languages, they tend to be poorer. Now, there are other confounding factors and so on, but you can control for, and studies have tried to kind of extract the true relationship while adjusting for those things. But it basically kind of seems to be quite strong. This idea that the more uniform you have your languages, the more modernization or economic prosperity you have. Now, this idea of modernity being linked to language loss and kind of conformity in language speaking dates back to Max Weber, his theories of rationalization, that societies over time become, say, for instance, more modern, more rational, and everyone speaking language in a uniform manner would kind of play into this idea. So if we zoom back into Ireland, you can see that Ireland in the 19th century is poor, but after the famine, it's a huge shock. And then that, is a watershed moment from which Ireland starts to recover economically, modernize in several respects. And this modernization process goes hand in hand with the language loss. So that's why, as economic historians, people say, oh, this is a history topic, but this is why economists might be interested in it. And for people who are not familiar with the Irish language, there's good evidence that the Irish language was being spoken at least from the 4th century onwards. Here I have a picture of an ogham stone, which are these stones where there's just different marks across them that symbolize very crude writing, but we know this is in Irish. And then there's a Columkill and the Book of Kells, and in part of the Book of Kells is written in Irish. It's not all in Latin, so there's some Irish in the Book of Kells. The development of the Irish language historically has followed other languages. So we have Ye Old English, which converts to, now we have modern English, but Irish starts off as primitive, in a primitive state, evolves to modern, Old Irish, Middle Irish, early modern, and now we have what we speak, or don't speak, as the case might be, modern Irish. And German language is the same, English language is the same. Just the path languages take as they become more standardized and different words get added in and they evolve naturally. So Irish is very much kind of like not particularly unique in its trajectory up until I'd say before the 19th century, but in the 19th century, there's a big loss in language. Uh, the loss of the Irish language is inherently politicized. And the reason for that is that the loss of Irish language is associated with the rise in English speaking, associated with British rule in Ireland. In the 18th century, large parts of the country are already English speaking. It's the language of commerce, it's the language of government. And if you want to get ahead in society, the best way to do it is by speaking English. If you only have Irish speaking ability, it very much acts as a handicap on your potential economic career and social mobility. But despite this, Irish speaking was still very, very common in the 19th century, particularly in the West, North, and also pockets around the Oriole, in Louth and Armagh, up in the Sperrin Mountains too, in Derry, Tyrone. So the Irish speaking is very common in the 19th century, and then it just drops off a cliff. And I'm going to show you some graphics that kind of demonstrate the scale of this loss. Historians have taken a long-standing interest in this question, and Nicholas Wolff, who's a historian based in the US, points to three villains which are typically proposed. Daniel O'Connell, because three villains have been proposed not by Wolff but by scholars throughout in the literature. The first is Daniel O'Connell, and the reason Daniel O'Connell is seen as a factor that explains Irish language loss is that the rise of his repeal movement and the Catholic emancipation didn't have this kind of cultural element to it. Irish as a kind of political movement only really gains traction towards the end of the 19th century, associated with kind of romantic nationalism. So, and then by that stage, it's almost too late. So by not incorporating this kind of cultural element into the kind of big mass political movement that was based around Daniel O'Connell, he's seen as someone who kind of let Irish slip. Another factor people have and historians have looked at when trying to understand language loss is the rise of national schools. Ireland is actually very advanced in education terms in the 19th century. While it's poor, it had an amazing system of hedge schools which predated the national schooling system. But in the 1830s, starting in 1834, a new national schooling system emerges whereby parents can send their children to school for free, and they are taught a national curriculum that's standardized across the island.
Alan, can I ask you to just explain briefly what a hedge school was, just for people who wouldn't be familiar with that?
Yeah, with the penal laws, Catholics were forbidden from going to school. So a system of, well, technically illegal, but they weren't very much like strongly policed. Schools emerged, and these schools would vary tremendously in quality, and they're called hedge schools. But I think that's, if you look at the 1826 education report, they detail all the schools. I'm proposing in a future research to actually go in and digitize that and map that and try and understand where these schools are and who's the principals, what's the religious makeup of the schools. That's a topic for future research. But the quality of these schools varies tremendously. There's some that are just rooms above a pub or a shop, or a cabin, windowless cabin. But then there's just like some schools that are very well endowed, a lot of them by evangelical societies, such as the Kildare Place Society. And the idea is they're trying to not only educate children, but also get them interested in Protestantism more generally. But there's also there's just tremendous variation. But there's a big interest in education in Ireland that's very long-standing. And the difference with national schools coming in was, well, firstly, they were free. even though the head schools had been supplemented. But secondly, they have the standard curriculum, and part of the standard curriculum did not include Irish. They spoke. National schools are taught exclusively through the medium of English. Now, there is both because of pressure from parents and also in the school's ethos was there would be often punishments for speaking Irish in school with tally sticks where teachers would look at students and try and find if they're speaking Irish. And if they accumulated a certain amount of offences for this, they would be punished. And so the national schools is a big radical change in how people are speaking language day to day. That comes in at the same time with Irish language loss. So it's only reasonable we're going to be able to try and assess its importance. The last element that's been traditionally kind of seen as a villain in terms of the language loss is the Catholic Church. And a bit like Daniel O'Connell, they are blamed for not incorporating this kind of cultural element into their work. And in some cases, the Catholic Church is very much on the side of the move towards English speaking. And it's not based on any it's not based on any kind of real, political movement other than pure pragmatism. They see English as the language of the future, the language of development, and Ireland is, for the most part, desperately poor in the 19th century, and it would be better for the greater good, basically, if people started speaking English and had good English proficiency. And so they were very much, they're very much into the mind of historians blaming language loss. However, revisionist historians in this space have kind of raised some qualms about these reasons. Firstly, Brian O'Keefe in 1980, he has a book and he says that there are other factors more important than Daniel O'Connell, national schools and Catholic Church. Economic shifts, demographics, depopulation, these are more important for the language loss than these other factors around national schools and church and Daniel political movements. Maureen Wall has a paper or a chapter in 1969, and this is actually probably the most relevant for what we find thereafter. And she says that the national schools really can't have been the catalyst which propelled language loss, because the head school system was firstly comprehensive. There's over 12,000 head schools operating all throughout Ireland. Now, the quality of them was patchy, but basically they're all teaching English to a standard where people would be able to speak it. Now, head school attendance for parents was not compulsory, even though people sent their kids there, even though attendance was high. And the reason for that is that the Irish people had a great interest in education. They wanted their children to go to a head school. They wanted their children to learn English because they saw that as the best possible opportunity for their prosperity in later lives. So rather than being a top-down state decision that mandated English speaking, it was actually more not coercive. It was a voluntary decision for people to firstly start learning English in terms of reading and writing, but also speaking it in day-to-day life. And that's the point made by Sean Dufresne in 1965, where he says basically there is not an element of coercion. It's basically Irish was rejected by the population purely for pragmatic reasons. There's a big literature and economics on language, which I'm not going to get into, so I don't really want to go through this slide in any detail. But the one thing I would say is that important for our paper and our models later on are two elements. The first element is networks. And if you're modeling language loss, you have to not just think about individuals speaking language to one another, but you need to think about it very holistically. And there's a whole set of models that will help you do this. So are there changes not on an individual basis, but at a network level? So we're very much thinking kind of big picture. Now, what our analysis will allow us to do will allow us to kind of trace out what's the most important network for Irish language speaking. Is it people in your household? Is it people on your street? Or is it, which is the townland? Or is it people in the wider district or even the county level? So there's some kind of optimal level at which people will start speaking language, and then there's going to be some point at which people who are too far from each other to matter. So we're actually able to trace out that network. The second element that we incorporate in is this idea of intergenerational transmission. And the way I always explain this is by thinking about The Godfather, right? Because if you watch The Godfather, you know that the Don Corleone, he doesn't speak it, he speaks Sicilian, and his English is his second language. Okay, so there's a radical change in terms of the Corleone family because they go to America where English is the language. Now he is speaking English as a second language. Then you have his son, Michael Corleone, played by Al Pacino. His English is his primary language, his first language. So, but he can speak Sicilian. We know he goes to Sicily. We know he communicates with the locals there. We see him speaking it in the movie. Now, Michael Corleone has a son who we see in the movies does not speak Sicilian. Okay, so what this says is that language is intergenerationally transmitted, but it's done in a way where what actually happens to your grandparents can influence whether you speak a language or not. And that's what we find in our data when we're looking at it, that there are things happening long before in the early part of the 19th century that sever the intergenerational transmission of language. So it's not the grandparents who lose the Irish speaking ability, but it's actually their grandchildren by the medium of their parents. And once you start looking at the data, you can see this is very clear how language is transmitted. And we think this has very important implications for policy, because it says, like, if you're interested in reviving the Irish language, you're not going to do it overnight. You really need to make policy changes and then look how they affect things, now, because age of first birth is in the 30s. You're talking about, 60, 70 years down the line before you can see real tangible changes, which is interesting. I'm going to go through the things we do, but I think it's probably best if I start just looking at some of the maps and the data, and hopefully they'll be of interest to you. But before I do, I just want to say that we're going to look at these the language loss through 4 different channels. The first thing we're going to do is try and approximate some kind of optimal sociolinguistic geography. So basically, what determines whether you speak a language? Is it people in your house, or is it people on your road? If you're the only house in the whole country who speaks a language, that language is not going to survive. If you're like the only street in the country, maybe it's a bit more vibrant. Or if your community extends to what we have, the district electoral divisions, which is let's say a town, they're roughly the size of a town. Is it the town, or is it the broader county level that matters? So we're going to study the transmission across these different geographies and see what one gives us the most explanatory punch. Then we're going to look at a series of statistical variables that look or try and get at this idea that education policy is important, church and state policy is important, and then the socioeconomic and demographic change, so the famine, the subsequent waves of emigration of the famine, will all be able to try and statistically tie them to language loss. And it's about seeing what gives us the most traction in terms of the language development. Our data for this come from the 1901 census. So I've been spending, over a decade curating the census returns, which you can see online. They're a fantastic geographical resource, but the drawback is that people entered information into it textually. So, under the religion or religious column, there's over 100,000 different responses with people spelling Roman Catholic and Protestant and Church of Ireland or Presbyterian in every different, you won't believe the amount of spelling mistakes people make. So trying to standardize that and standardize things like occupation has been a kind of a labor of love for me over the last while, but I've got the data into a really good condition now. And in 1901, for us, with the thing that's interesting is that they surveyed people whether they were Irish speaking or not. And I can tell you now that when I'm talking about Irish speaking in this data source, I'm not talking about monolingualism. So there's only a less than 1% of the population is monolingual by this point, like just Irish speaking only. And then nearly 20% is both Irish and English speaking, or at least that's what they answer on the census form. I don't know necessarily how their ability of Irish, because I have a cúpla focal, I could probably say I'm Irish and English on a census form and no one would be able to check. So we have to bear that in mind. The data can be a bit patchy in that respect. But when we actually start mapping it and looking at it, it looks very sensible in terms of the temporal trajectory, but also the spatial one too. And to trace the language loss over time, we borrow Garrett Fitzgerald's idea. So, I mean, my research actually overlaps with Garrett Fitzgerald's quite a bit. It's because I've studied railways as well. Now I'm studying the Irish language. I don't know when I'm going to become the Irish Taoiseach, but I'll probably be in a few more years' time. And we do what Garrett Fitzgerald did, which is just take the age of the person as a rough proxy for language loss across age cohorts. So what you see in these areas that lose Irish is people who are really old. They're more likely to be Irish speaking than people who are younger. And then we use that age of birth to trace the language loss. I hope people can see this data. It's a series of maps and it highlights the disappearance of Irish over the 19th century. So what we see is this Irish-speaking majorities, people who are born between 1821 and 1831. So in 1901, they are between 70 and 80 years of age in the census. And the green or the dark green, they're basically communities or districts where over half the population speaks Irish. And you can see the very clear east-west divide. Irish is strong in the west of Donegal, Mayo, Galway, Limerick, Kerry, Cork, Waterford. So there's a kind of a frontier basically. Aside from, as I was saying, around the Sperrin Mountains, and this is the Oriole. There are just some pockets of Irish speaking. It follows roughly a frontier. And then what we can see as we fast forward, look at the different birth cohorts over time, we can see this frontier slowly slipping back. And look at this, by the end of the 19th century, these are people who are aged between 20 and 30 who are living in these communities. Irish has, disappeared from half of Galway, half of Mayo, almost gone from Cork. You're losing a lot in Kerry, and it's very patchy in Waterford. So that's the thing we're interested in, trying to explain why the language is lost in those particular areas rather than places that are able to maintain it. Is there something different about those areas? That was a kind of look at the frontier in terms of a binary measure. We can also zoom out and look at this in terms of continuous change. And here we have map A and map B. And the map A and map B actually gives a graduated scale to Irish speaking, going from 0% to 100%. And we can see that actually the binary scale that I was using before is actually doing a pretty good job. This distribution seemed to have basically two outcomes. You're either near enough 100% Irish speaking or you're 0. So, and then there's a bit of, gray-ish in the lighter green in the middle, but not that much. That's the pre-famine birth cohorts. For people who are born in the years after the famine, you can see the scale of the language loss, which I've highlighted in the last graph on this map C, which is the difference. And in the difference, it goes up to 50 percentage points. So in some communities, over half the population lost their language between 1821 to 41 and 1861 to 1881, pre and post famine. So these are huge linguistic shifts occurring across a few decades. We can look at this data based on the year of birth and Irish speaking ability and kind of extrapolate it to trends. So if you're looking at people born before the famine, 2 in 5 are Irish speaking or have Irish speaking ability in some bilingual sense. Now, if you think that the pre-famine population was, 8.7, 8.5, maybe even 8.7 million, right? And you extrapolate around, well over a third with Irish speaking ability, a big population with a big share, there was a lot of Irish speakers, could have been between 2 to 3 million Irish speakers before the famine. Then at the end of the period, you're talking around 10% on a much smaller population. So this is like almost 500,000. So how do you go from 2 to 3 million to 500,000? That's a radical change, even though the decline looks quite steep quite steady in terms of share terms. In population terms, it's a big loss. And this draws us to the question of, well, what else is happening during this period? And it's very simple to just look at some other graphs and say, for instance, well, hold on, literacy is going up during this time period. So at the, when 2 in 5 were speaking Irish, 1 in 2 couldn't read and write, and by the end of the 19th century, nearly everyone can read and write. There's almost full literacy. So there's a big change in education. Is this linked to Irish language loss? That's what we're going to be able to investigate. But, rather than just stop here and saying that this is an educational effect, we're going to look at other things. So we're able to tie language loss to population. So this is the trajectory of the Irish population between 1791 and 1901. And you can see what a big effect the famine has. You're well over 8 million. Probably closer to 9 on the eve of the famine. And then we have big decline in famine, but you have huge emigration thereafter. So population could be another contributor. The next map is another map that's, again, very, very close to my heart. It's based around the introduction of railways and the railway network. Now, when we think about pre-famine Ireland, it's actually much bigger geographically in terms of being able to get from A to B. So the first map of this quadrant gives us information about the travel time it takes to get to Dublin from everywhere else in the country. Unsurprisingly, it's less than an hour if you're in Dublin to get to Dublin City. That shouldn't be a surprise because it's so close. But as you radiate out from Dublin, you can see those travel times actually get quite extreme. So if you're on the western frontier, you're talking over a day to get to Dublin City. Fast forward to 1901, the turn of the 20th century. When we fast forward with the introduction of the railway, that time it takes to get from, say, for instance, Galway to Dublin, it goes from a day to 3 hours, right? And the net result of this is to make the whole island much smaller, not, in physical terms, but in, remoteness. So people on the West are being exposed to radical change, new ideas, people, newspapers, new goods and products, all this kind of change in a very short period of time, which again overlaps with the language loss. So we want to include that into our model. The next graph is a scatter plot, and if you'll give me the time, I'd like to explain it because I think it's fascinating. What I'm doing here is I'm essentially trying to understand occupations and their share of Irish speaking within them. So we're just looking across the 1901 census at different occupational categories. And on the x-axis, I've just put the fully literate. So the literacy within the occupation. Now, the reason I've done that is because it will give you an idea of the occupation's prestige, whereby occupations which have higher levels of literacy will also be more prestigious. So you can think of professionals like solicitors, doctors. You'd imagine they're basically fully literate. Also, you have occupations like priest, teacher, shopkeeper. They do require a level of literacy, and you do get prestige from them. But then you have occupations such as tinsmiths, which don't require much literacy, agricultural laborers, very low literacy again, and so on. So you can see the names dotted around this scatter plot. And then on the y-axis, I've looked at the share of the occupation's Irish-speaking ability. And what you can see is that far from being some kind of vector for social mobility, there's actually tremendous diversity in Irish-speaking ability across different occupational classes. The one I always like to highlight is in terms of weavers. So you have wool weavers, who would be in the West primarily. They have like over half of them are Irish-speaking or have Irish-speaking ability. Where the linen weavers, they're very down at the very bottom, nearly none of those have any Irish-speaking ability, but they have a similar job in terms of its probably skill level to wool weavers. So there's this going from 50% to 0%. And the reason for that is it's not the occupational task or the structure, but it's location. It's like linen weavers are in the north where there's very little Irish speaking, and wool weavers are in the west where there's Irish speaking is more prevalent.
Alan, can I ask, can you do any cross-reference in relation to the male female dominant occupations, just in that?
We try to abstract from looking at males and females, not because we're ignorant, but because there are problems with women in the census and their answers, especially in households, where it's the household head who typically fills it out on behalf of the woman, and you get his perspective rather than the woman's perspective. And things like age or their Irish speaking ability are actually, when they are cross-referenced against known sources, they can be incorrect. So there's more inaccuracy with the women's answers due to that. So you can have like cases where there's a bilingualism or non-bilingualism simply because the household head puts his level of literacy, his level of Irish speaking in as the wife's answer, so we were kind of reluctant to break it down on the gender lines for that reason. But it's something we could look at in future.
But not certainly good to understand that there's that complexity when you're analyzing those documents and trying to take the information out of them. You can't just depend on everything you're reading either. Thank you.
We might come back to that and look at it. It's just there's a lot of work gone into getting the data to the stage we have it now. Maybe when we have more time and latitude in the future, we'll come back to it, just because there's lots of different things we needed to get into shape to answer the question as it is. But the last point I want to make before I move on is just that the relationship here is negative. So if you model it with a statistical model, there's a negative correlation. So more literate occupations tend to be less Irish speaking, but there are many exceptions. Parish priests, for example, have very good Irish ability, and it's a very literate profession. Teachers, shopkeepers, publicans. So you'll notice about these occupations, which are, though there are many exceptions, which is an oxymoron a bit, but they're public facing. So when the occupation has some kind of public facing role, they'll be more likely to be bilingual because they'll be interacting in multiple languages. So far from being important vehicle for social mobility and economic progress, having a bit of Irish can be actually beneficial for lots of occupations. So it can't be the only thing changing or driving this at the time as we see it, even though there is somewhat of a relationship. The data analysis that we do is based on just trying to figure out people who live in those areas which lost Irish, which is about 250,000 of them, who are aged between 20 and 39 in the Irish famine, whether they speak Irish or not. So we're going to build an econometric model. Not going to go through the details, but that econometric model will basically have an outcome, a defined outcome, which is whether you're Irish speaking or not, binary, and then we'll have inputs into that model. And the inputs will consist of education variables. It will consist of variables measuring improvements to transport. It will measure the degree to which someone's occupation was Irish speaking, and so on. So we do have lots of different explanatory variables to go through. And if you want to look at our sample size, this is what I always show people when I'm presenting this, is that the reason we focus on people who had previously lived in areas that had an Irish speaking majority is that they are the people who lose Irish over this time, simply because if you're in an area which did not have a pre-famine Irish speaking majority, less than 10% of people are speaking, even going back to 1821 to 31. So there's very little Irish to lose in these areas, whereas we focus and target people who essentially live in places that had been Irish had previously thrived, but for some reason it drops off in this time period. And there's a lot of words here, but the way I'd summarize them is to just say that the first task we do is to try and match the level of Irish speaking with the spatio-linguistic territory. So basically that is trying to draw the line on what level of community is Irish being transmitted through. Is it the household? Is it the street or townland or rural townland? Or is it the wider community, county or district electoral division? So the district electoral division is basically, you can think of this as town or village. They're the units of the geographical units I was showing you earlier with the maps, and they're around 25 kilometers squared. And what we find here is that, whether your parents or grandparents speak Irish, that's really important. But just as important, and in terms of just explanatory power, what is happening in your community and your district electoral division matters as much, if not more, than what's happening in your household. So the individual household, I was very surprised by this, and we've checked it lots of times, but it seems to be very much a community-based movement in language loss rather than things that were just being transmitted in the kind of narrow corridor of the household. So we bear that in mind when we look at our analysis to bring in those factors which moved at the district level rather than the household level. This is essentially a summary of our main results, and I'll go through it as best I can. The way I've broken things up here is to specify factors in the first half of the graph that are things that are changing at an individual level, like one's religion, whether one is residing in their birth county, so are they a migrant or not, one's occupations, Irish speaking. And they're all factors that matter, and I've ranked them in order. But before I describe those individually, I just want to say what's in the bottom half here. And the bottom half is the variables that move based on a DED or contextual level. So these are things that are changing in the community rather than for the individual. If I go back to the top here, you can see that the most important predictor of Irish speaking ability is one's religion. Now, why even though it gives us the biggest bar and it has the most punch, and the most traction, it's actually not really that interesting because there's not a mass movement of people changing religion over this time period. So people's religion and the size of religious communities is not behind the Irish language loss. But it's interesting that it's basically in our sample, around 42% of people speak Irish. And what this is basically saying is that if you speak Irish, there's nearly 100% chance you're Catholic. Okay, so you have Irish speaking ability. Then the next variable that's important at an individual level is whether you reside in your birth county. So have you moved within Ireland? And we find that's important. So if you're not going to move and you stay in your birth county, you're far more likely to speak Irish. Now that is important for, informing us of whether what things are changing, because it says people who are more likely to move are also those people who are not likely to speak Irish. So mass migration has some explanatory sway there in that respect. I want to just look at this before I look at anything else. It's just this Roman Catholic name index. So we had talked before about the importance of names and using names as a demographic marker. Previously, people have proposed that the Catholic Church were very instrumental in language loss over this time period. Well, what's a good test of this? It's one's first name. So we assume, and I don't think it's unreasonably so, we assume that children who have more explicitly Catholic first names, Christian names, that they are more adherent to the church and church teachings. So you can see this very much in the data, because we have everyone's first name, and we have names, and we have everyone's religion. And you can see there are some names like Ignatius, Cornelius, that are, 100% predictors of whether someone's Catholic or not. And then there's, mixed names like John and so on, where you get names where the religion could be anything based on the name. So with that in mind, we have some kind of measure of, we think, religiosity. So how adherent were the parents of the individual to the Catholic Church? And if these people were more adherent to the Catholic Church and more interested in what the church's sayings were and more influenced by it, you might imagine that these children would be less likely to speak Irish, because the church is telling them, you don't need to speak Irish. You're better off learning English for pragmatic reasons. And you've already kind of signaled to us you like what we say by naming your child a very explicitly Catholic name. But in fact, the opposite is true. These very explicitly Catholic names are positively correlated with Irish speaking. So if the church was, communicating to its followers, the Catholic Church was communicating to its followers, look, drop Irish, it certainly wasn't a message that was being taken up by people on an individual level. There's far more. And in fact, the correlation actually goes the opposite way. So which is interesting. Now I'll talk about some of the other variables I have in the blue bars, and they are things that are changing at the community level. The most important result here is that we have good measures of how literate the community was before the introduction of national schools. And this is really interesting, because it just so turns out that differences in literacy that predate the introduction of national schooling actually have the most explanatory power in our regression models. And this goes back to Maureen Wald's and others' point, is that the people were becoming education is an important vehicle, because you now have this kind of community structure where people are going to meet and they're speaking not in Irish but in English all day long, and then that has a spillover effect into community where they keep that up. But we find that actually imprints itself 2 generations down the line. And it's giving us the most explanatory power, more explanatory power than national schooling increases, and then it's the schooling literacy or schooling for the person. In fact, if some individual is fully literate, they're less likely to be Irish speaking, but it's a very small effect, as you can see in the minus 2.9% red bar up there. So what's happening in your community in terms of the educational structure historically is more important than what's happening contemporaneously for these people, but also what's happening to them on an individual basis. We find some evidence to suggest that the population fall because of the famine was important, and it's as you would expect. Places that are more adversely affected by the famine are more likely to lose
Irish as a language, but it's not, in terms of its magnitude, it's not giving the same traction or the same swing that we get from the education variables. It's a secondary factor here. The other elements that we have were the introduction of railways and the importance of transport infrastructure. Again, that seems to not have the same explanatory power. It doesn't seem to do what we wanted to do in the models in terms of trying to understand language loss. It's really education happening at the community level, happening historically. That's the thing. That's the things that's causing the language loss. And we have several other variables as well, but I'm not going to talk about them because they're secondary.
Alan, I'll just mention there for people though that the DED stands for District Electoral Division.
Yes.
Just so especially for people who haven't seen the chat or
That's
watching the recording.
25 kilometer square. Think of it as a village or a town. It's not the townland, which is another structure. The way I think about it, I think the townland is basically everyone on your street. But in the rural setting, that's obviously going to be a little different, but they're very small units. And then the district electoral division is these bigger kind of units that are, I don't know what they are in miles and so on, and acres or whatever, but it's 25 kilometers squared is the yardstick I always use. And then you have the county stuff, which just is
an average around by 15, just over 15 square miles.
Okay, yeah.
Around that.
Yeah. So basically, that's the end of the talk. I mean, that's what we find. It's an ongoing area of research, although we've written up and I've presented this in several places. So rather than me go on any more than I need to, I'm happy to stop here, and I'm also happy for people to have questions or feedback.
Alan, do you want to stop sharing there, if that's okay?
Yeah, sorry. There we go.
Jared, sorry, you'll have to unmute yourself again. I had to. And Jared, do you want to comment at all first, or?
Well, I think if you read some of the comments out there, Dolores, then maybe I can chip in with bits and pieces.
Yeah.
Will you censor them, please, first?
So just okay.
Only read the nice ones.
No, let me just. There were one or few queries, and people actually answered the questions in the chat. Let me just go through them. Sorry again, bear with me. Someone actually was asking about the railroads and kind of development of the railway system in Ireland. If you want to kind of comment just briefly on that. I know Joe was very good to put in the chat that the first railway in Ireland opened in 1834 at its peak. In 1920, Ireland had 5,600 kilometers, just almost 3,500 miles of railway. Now only about half of this remains, and a large area along the border, that being the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, has no railway service.
You have to get me back next year to talk about this.
That's another.
I could do another hour on this, because I've two research projects on this. The first is just looking at the railways and their impact on population. And the other one is looking at the border. So the border is really important for railways because it breaks up this natural kind of hinterland, and you get lots of rail closures around border regions. But I think it also has a secondary effect in terms of road development and just the network of transport around Ireland. So that's something I'm doing as well. But yeah, in terms of the railways, I have maps of railways in Ireland going back to 1834, and I've been using it to, not in terms of just the history, but there's a literature in economic geography trying to understand the importance of market access. And effectively what I have is a Google map, and the Google map says how can you get from A to B in Ireland in 1941, 1951, all the way to 1911. In terms of both cost, freight rates, and
wages, but also in terms of time. And so I've just been putting that together, using it in my research to understand, how remoteness changed over time. So
Like your
yeah,
map earlier on in your presentation showing just the time difference with the
yeah,
development of the railway system
yeah.
and what it took from the
It's
west of Ireland
it's
to
revolutionary. I mean, you
like
can't get from
completely.
you can get Galway to Dublin is 2 to 3 hours now, as
Yeah.
is. Like, so going from 24 hours to 3 is a huge difference.
And interesting to notice how time travel hasn't improved any further. It's
But
just
no,
it got literally overnight
yeah,
transformed, and
yeah,
those are the consistent times. We
yeah,
still actually in saying that probably maybe some parts of the island again maybe having no per rail access now, actually
yeah,
journey times are probably actually longer again because you're depending on the road networks.
yeah. Well, I mean, you can
We're
look at the infrastructure even around Monaghan. Like, you've got like Rockcarry had its own train station and stuff like that.
Smithborough had its own like one of the major hubs for Ulster was Clonus,
Yeah, yeah,
all that go. And with that, okay, you know, it had a serious economic impact on these towns as well with the closure of the railway
yeah,
system. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
But it's just like, yeah, it becomes a lot of them became economically infeasible around the border. I mean, the border is the real shock there.
Just Fiona asks with the linen versus woolen, knowing your chart in relation to occupation, their literacy level and Irish language been spoken. Fiona asks with the linen versus woolen, is there any we got occupations? Is there any difference attributable to the route to market and interaction with sellers buyers? That's probably very unlikely. It's probably just more geographical location, isn't it?
I think it's geographical location.
Would you say linen more
The
Ulster?
linen weavers are just in places where they're no speaking Irish, whereas the wool weavers are very much proto industry, cottage industry, where they're not in urban areas and they're in the west. But there's probably some elements of what people are doing on a day-to-day basis, and how that plays into the occupation as well. Like, I wouldn't rule out the occupation being
Yeah.
important in some respects, but for
Depending,
me, it is a
yeah.
geographical thing rather than an occupational. I was just thinking of in terms of, this is the task, this is what you're doing all day. Um, and
And
I think
also maybe,
they're probably more similar than certainly, someone who's a parish priest or a publican.
yeah, it's just, but as you said, the geographical location is the influence there, though the jobs
Yeah,
are very similar. Um, just Kevin said here, thanks for the compelling presentation. Great graphics and maps to back up your work as always, Alan. You're always good with having the maps, which is great because it's just you see things so much more visually.
yeah,
And the impact is
yeah.
there very much. Just Eamon says, I'm not sure what this means. I read recently there was one area of, not sure what actually your question means, Eamon. Maybe you want to type that in again. Do you see that, Alan, from Eamon? Did you
So
see that one?
there's a lot of questions.
Okay, sorry. Okay, Elizabeth said, okay, great. Thanks. Great. Oh yeah, Joe says, would love to hear more about the railways. Yeah, certainly. I think that would actually really be really interesting. Um, Fiona says, thank you for the brilliant presentation. Can you talk a little more about the role of immigration and the draw and influence about siblings, etc., encouraging family members to immigrate?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah, that is another factor, isn't it?
That's
Potential, yeah.
that's why I think education is really important. It's like people are learning English not to stick around, and the Anglosphere is really rising in importance over this time period. So if you've got an education, if you've got an English speaking education, it's your ticket to prosperity, but ticket to prosperity under the proviso that you're going to leave Ireland, and that's very much the assumption that you're not going to be sticking around. So the education factor is not just on its own, but it's like Ireland has basically reorientated itself from being, people are learning for the sake of staying in their communities and building up the economy that way, to basically learning to pragmatically say, the best my children can do is to just leave. And this is there's the story of like Pádraig Pearse went and met Irish speaking communities, and he went and was like, impressing on the people the importance of speaking Irish to their children and having their children educated with Irish medium. And the Irish speaking parents just looked at him and said, like, well, it's all well and good, but like, they're not your kids. Like, well, I have to think my kid's future, so there is that element with education. It's not just specifically the school as this kind of coercive institution. The kind of mechanics happening behind there is this big pull of the Anglosphere, the ticket to America, Britain, elsewhere.
And I suppose how people who had emigrated communicate with those back home. Some may have used Irish, and some graduates have decided to more use English, depending what family members maybe they were communicating with.
Yeah, the Irish speaking in America is and England is very much the exception rather than the rule. So you'll read like there are lots of stories and anecdotes and qualitative information that like people are speaking Irish, not in Ireland, but it's just not on a scale which would help or have a kind of impact on the language vitality,
Eamon asked, comments. He says, I read recently there was one area of Ireland left with native Irish speakers. There was a debate about funding of retaining that before it was lost. Given the grandparent-parent effects, should that area be supported? Eamon, there's actually a number of areas in Ireland or in the island as well. There's some small pockets of Irish speakers also in Northern Ireland, and there's a number of areas, mainly throughout the west and southern border of the Republic, that still has Irish speakers. So there's certainly more than one, but do you have any comment on that, Alan or Gerard?
The policy implications of this research are kind of just basically you need to kind of think long term about this. I'm fairly agnostic, and I'd be a bit on the fence as to what appropriate policy responses are. However, I'm pretty certain and clear that having good funding for Gaeltacht areas is essential for the vitality of the language. That without them, Irish would be in a far worse state. And even if you want to say, for instance, have an interest in the Irish language, really learn it, you need to go to those Gaeltachts. You're not going to. So I mean, having those areas a kind of like last bastion. It to me, I don't know all the specifics of the funding or whatever, but it seems pretty sensible to have those pillars to kind of at least moor your language on. Has Irish been revived? I mean, you look at the census statistics, you get good numbers of people reporting Irish speaking, but for me, I think like to have a language really revived, it's not about the knowing the words, knowing the grammar, but it's basically, are people using it on a day-to-day basis to live their lives, not just do it in school, not just do it because you need an Irish exam to become a teacher or and the other.
I think that's where we might have been slightly let down there now, to be honest, Alan. And thankfully that there is a revival where it's the recognition of a language to be enjoyed. It's part of the heritage. It's influence around us. Or like our place names or surnames. Our use of the English language is influenced by
but
Irish language.
They're even worried now about young children in Gaeltacht areas being caught speaking.
For people who weren't aware, Gaeltacht areas is what we call an area that is Irish language speaking. And traditionally too, Gaeltacht areas would economically, I suppose partly for most because of their geographical location, economically they would have quite a lot of challenges and suffer very highly from immigration of the communities too, but it's very common for students especially to go for a few weeks of for a few weeks in a summer period to the Gaeltacht to improve their Irish and have good crack, actually, probably more than anything. But they do say it's the
If you're
best
not
place.
sent home.
If you're not sent home. Some are very strict, and if you speak
Yeah.
English at all, you're sent home. But I think the crack is meant to be great on the Gaeltacht, and there actually are Gaeltacht programs for adults as well. You
But
know, more
it's very hard. It's very hard to compete with English. It really is.
very
I mean,
very
the
yeah.
cultural, dominance
And
of English. It's not about, you know, nations, but it's just like all the movies are in English,
yes,
like all the books are in English. It's just, I just Ireland, it doesn't have the scale. It's so hard to compete. I don't envy the job of people trying to mastermind the revival of the Irish language. It's a difficult
and
task.
and as you mentioned earlier too, other countries are recognizing the challenges they're facing. Were there at the time of the famine different types of Irish? No, Irish is just the one language. There would be different dialects, usually across provinces, different dialects rather than different, if I'm
But
answering that
that's
correctly.
that's tricky. I mean, I remember from secondary school there's an oral test,
Yeah,
and the oral test is basically you're given a tape and the teacher or examiner will play it, and then you have to it will test your comprehension. And if you got someone who's Northern, Donegal,
this is,
Ulster Irish,
yeah.
you would do worse if you're
You
in
could
Dublin.
you could be in a school where your teacher this year speaks Irish with a more Ulster Irish dialect,
Yeah.
and next year your teacher could have Munster Irish dialect, and that would create challenges. Yeah, as you said. And then when it comes to the exam, this one tape is rolled out for every student,
Yeah.
and you're learning different dialects of Irish. You
But
know,
I mean, there is a point about the 19th century as well, is that by the time English is really overtaking Irish, there isn't a professor of Irish in a university or kind of a network of scholars seeking to standardize the language in the same way as that English was being standardized with proper grammar rules that everyone's following in the same path. So when you have literature, everyone's literally on the same page. Because of firstly the scale, but just obviously there isn't the kind of academic network in Ireland at that time. So Irish is caught on the hop a little bit as well, even though there are print materials and they were growing over this time period. But it just didn't have the same rules or kind of like
yeah.
strict rules as English.
And all these have a factor in maintaining a language and the development of a language. I think poor Fiona here, I think her head's fried. She's saying here that her mind's spinning. So
All right.
we've given her too much information.
Oh dear.
What about market towns in the West and fair days interaction with buyers, sellers, for example, Meath, Dublin, also commercial travellers from the North? I'm
Yeah.
not sure what she means exactly, but I suppose this is it. Again, the movement of people, as you said earlier, easy movement influences,
Yeah,
especially when it comes to commerce, influences, and everybody has to have a common language to use.
I mean, that's with the introduction of railways. You get this network of traveling salesmen who are traveling east to west for the first time with different goods. And, you have to, but, in our data, it's bilingual. So most people do have English speaking ability. It's really whether they're keeping the Irish on, bilingually.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't see any reason why Ireland couldn't be bilingual today, but do I have any brilliant ideas to achieve that? No, unfortunately not.
And as you say, it takes time.
Yeah.
Jimmy, Jimmy said, Russell spread the cooperative movement through the railway. Would that have had any effect on the degradation of the language?
I haven't checked that, but I don't think, because our we do have railway results and we do have so we have the network of canals and navigable waterways as well as the old roads that you could travel by horse and carriage. Now, what we find is that the language loss follows a trajectory along the old transport networks. So the one that predates the railways, that has way more explanatory power than the introduction of the railways. And the introduction of the railways has a bit of an ambiguous finding. It's not super strong, and in fact, it could go the opposite way. I wouldn't hang my hat on saying railway has a positive or negative effect at this stage. So for it being creameries via the channel of railways, I don't think so.
Audrey said, is it fair to say that the language loss was politically motivated, given that it was a state decision to teach only English in schools?
That's what I wanted to test, and you can see that's why we have the education in terms of measure that's stratified over national schooling, hedge schooling, and then like what we call the post-national schooling period. So there's like a period, there's a big boost you get from the national schools coming in, and then you get another boost because the national schools are improving over time. But literacy is actually quite high before the introduction of national schools. These are English-speaking schools that parents want to send their kids to. That's what gives us the most explanatory power. That's not to say national schools aren't important and there's a political dimension to it. It just seems secondary to the national. It just seems secondary to the national schooling. The national schooling is secondary to the hedge school. And the hedge schools weren't state sanctioned, although they did have that element of evangelicalism and funding through the Kildare Place Society, London Hibernian Society, and so on. Whether we don't have the data yet to actually go in and see whether these hedge schools that have particular religious motives might translate into Irish speaking, but that's a fund I'm applying to actually get funding to digitize that data properly and map it. So that's a topic for future research.
Rosine says here that different dialects and accents exist all over the country. She grew up with Irish in West Waterford, but some of her classmates used to go to West Cork for Irish. Then for the Leaving Cert, which is the Leaving Cert for people is the formal state examinations when you finish your second level education in the Republic of Ireland. For the Leaving Cert, their books were Donegal Irish, which they found very difficult. Eamon just says here the native speaking is meaning the language learned from your family or community rather than at school. That would be correct, wouldn't it, Alan?
Sorry.
And native speaking is very much where the language is learned from within your home and community, not at school. Going back to really where it's your first language.
Yes.
Yeah.
As I say now, English as a second language is people who are speaking something at home and then English at school.
Do you have anything to comment? Sorry, Ger, I'm just going through this, the chat.
Well, when I think of language, my mind goes back to Kevin Francis' class in St. Paul's Junior High School in Lurgan, when it was écoutez, répétez, listen and repeat. I think, when you're trying to learn different languages, whether it be Irish or Russian, whatever, it's actually being immersed in the language that makes it easy. It's not being able to parse the verb, I, you, he, she, we, you, they. And we were discussing before you started recording, the problem with trying to learn a language. A child at 2 or 3 is hearing what its parents are saying and grandparents. It's not dealing with strict grammar. It's not dealing with past historic tenses, whatever. It's repeating what it hears. And my grandfather was born in County Leitrim in 1877. He had no Irish. His father was born 1847 on Droghhill. He had no Irish. And my mother, who went to national school in County Leitrim, had very, very basic Irish, basically reflecting what you were saying about poor teaching there. But I think when we talk, so Irish was well out by the time the 1840s came, and I think Alan's reflecting that in his research, and that the national school was sort of just tipping everything over the edge, accentuating a trend that was already there. It's interesting we talk about pragmatism, and pragmatism, what we mean is, you're basically dealing with the reality of what was colonialism. A Nigerian writer I heard talking recently said that when a colony imposes itself on another country, one of the first things that goes is the language, because the language is the glue that holds the native society together. When you think of Irish society, you think of, for example, the Brehon laws that were wiped out. I've looked at the indictment books for County Armagh they start in 1715, and it's interesting to see that, we were talking about names there. On the first couple of pages, you see one fella who's been indicted, and his surname is Mac Hughes. Now you go forward to 1760, there are no Mac Hugheses. That's gone. So this runs alongside the degradation of the language is the anglicization of names. My own name and the Mac and the A I've seen dropped, and it become just Tasney. And they moved to Belfast, again, a reflection of moving into the city. And which actually we talked about last week, and maybe it's a strange comparison, but the adoption of English in the city, the realization that you have to use English. We talked last week about suicide in the city, that when people moved into the city areas, there was more opportunity, to use that term, to commit suicide than there would have been in their native areas, because in the native areas they're so strongly bonded together, whereas in the cities and in the towns they were to a large degree by themselves. That natural glue that held their society together was now gone, and it was the same with language. So the land system as well, it was the English who created the county, created the baronial systems, which is very rarely used now, but when you're studying 19th century history, you've got baronies all over the place. So that was in English. So leases were made out in English. So it was essential to be able to speak English to survive in that society. And actually, I've studied threatening notices that were issued throughout the 1820s through to the 1850s, and I've yet to find one that was in Irish. Now, a threatening notice, you wouldn't expect to find one in Irish to a local landlord, and they're fascinating to read because they invariably have a drawing of a coffin on the page with his name on it, and various other things. But
they're very well written as well. They're very literate people writing them.
Could be school teachers write them, and
I think so.
Would. Yeah. But when you get a threatening notice to a priest, for example, for overcharging for marriage or baptism fees or whatever, nothing in Irish. I've never seen anything in Irish. And I'm just wondering, Alan, have you found any correlation between, it'd be fascinating to look at the study of the decline of the language between, say, 1700 and 1800. I'm just wondering, with the Relief Acts coming in the 1760s and with the penal laws slightly easing, would there have been more inclination then to learn English because there was a realization then that in order to get on in society, you've got the 1783 Catholics allowed to vote for the first time. They become 40 shilling freeholders. They can hold longer leases. Would there have been a recognition or an acceptance amongst the Catholic middle classes that they have to learn have to learn English, they have to understand English in order to be able to compete?
Yeah,
definitely. The commercial side of things.
Definitely. That's, what we're kind of looking at is we're seeing what's happening in 1901. So there's, centuries of history that predate us. And what we're finding with these, the biggest explanatory power is this stuff that goes on before the introduction of national schools. So you see the effect in 1901 of something that's happening in 1834, or sorry, pre-1834, even, 1810, 1820, that stuff's important. So the idea that there's seeds planted in the 18th century, absolutely, I would imagine that's that would play. You're not going to be able to get the data to look at this. We do have speaking of baronies, Gar Fitzgerald studied Irish at a baronial level, and our data actually matches quite well with his, but we see there wouldn't be any way to actually test because there's no difference between places in the ease of the penal laws unless you have a good suggestion for because we rely on differences between places rather than uniform changes, because national schools are not uniform. They're different everywhere, different coverage, different quality and so on. So I'm sure that could be there, but statistically detecting it, that's going to be trouble. But what our findings would suggest that's more than plausible. It's likely to be. I just after remembering you talking about language and people's interest in Irish, you can go on Duolingo. I don't know if people are familiar. It's a kind of it's an app people use for learning languages. It's the most popular one in the world, and there's two languages in the world people are learning: Spanish and English, right? And that's it. You see the world map, that's what it is. Apart from Ireland, Ireland stands out, and the most common language people are learning on Duolingo in Ireland is Irish. Now, it's a country learning its native language. It's like Spain, most popular language is Spanish. In England, Britain, most popular language is in Spain it's English. In England it's Spanish. In France it's Spanish. They're learning other languages. Whereas Ireland's the only country on this app that is learning its native language. So there definitely is an interest. I think people just the schooling system just doesn't get people, whether it's, it doesn't immerse them in the language when you're learning about, the Moke and Elok and, different tenses and so
What I
on.
can understand, and I'm sorry, what I don't understand is why, and I teach in various schools, and I remember talking to a German language assistant just a couple of months ago, and German students have been over to a grammar school in Belfast, and I remember saying to the German teacher afterwards, are your students as good at speaking German as they are as good at speaking English? And he just laughed and he says, no way, of course not. He says, but they've been learning it since they were 4 or 5. He said, our crowd start up in the north here, start learning when they're 11 or 12. And it is all grammar based. I mean, the oral side of things, I remember doing the A-level Irish, and the oral thing was almost like with 2 or 3 weeks to go, right? We need to cobble together a conversation here and hope to God that the examiner would stick to the strict parameters of what you had learned. Otherwise, buying a ticket at a railway station, etc., etc. If they went outside that, you were in big trouble, But but what she said it's easier to learn English. Because in Germany, as you made the point, all the films are in English. The music is in English. You're surrounded by English. And it's the same whether it be in Poland or Ukraine or in Scandinavia. They're surrounded by English. Whereas here, like if T.G. Carr had been there when I was learning Irish, my Irish would be so much better because even when you're listening to the games now, you'll hear things like, cooling to Scother B, what a fantastic point. And that usually refers to an Armagh's playing, of course. But I mean, whereas you never got that sort of thing. You were learning grim books, Miles Nagoplin, etc., and trying to understand idiomatic Irish when you couldn't actually even speak the basic Irish. And I think there's a major fault there in teaching, and it's the same in all languages. I mean, up in the north here, they can do A-level Spanish, French, German, and just about able to hold a very, very basic conversation in that language.
That's the problem. The emphasis on the learning of the language is simply about the written text form.
Yeah,
not about using it. And I remember for me to pass my Irish exams, because I couldn't get in. I happened to go to university in Northern Ireland, but at the time to go to university in the Republic of Ireland, you need to have passed Leaving Cert Irish unless you have an exemption. I would just memorize passages and passages of text from poems and short stories. I couldn't read any of it. Mm-hmm. I had no capacity to read it. I just had to memorize this text and I passed the exam.
Yeah, there's this essay, it's like a Timpish de Boher everyone had in their back pocket. It's like any story can be turned into a traffic accident,
just quickly.
Going to the beach, there's a traffic accident on the way.
And the same applied though for, as you say, other languages. And when it comes to examination of language, a very, very minute element is down to your hearing ability and spoken ability of the language. That applies both in the Republic and Northern Ireland, I think. But just you mentioned Brehon laws, Jared. Could you explain to your listeners just briefly what Brehon laws were, just so the understanding?
Laws, what were they? The Brehon laws were the ancient system of law in Ireland prior to the English introduction of law in the 1600s. So it was a very detailed, it dealt with all aspects of life. And it was through the Irish language, but it was developed over a period of 500-600 years. And it was wiped out once English colonial rule took hold in the 1600s. And then you had the whole English system of law being brought in with, and you'll see, and on here regularly, people are interested in genealogy. One of the great sources is the petty sessions. Because the petty sessions, the determined plays, was right at the grassroots where neighbours were fighting each other and there were, fellas were being found in shebeens after hours and all that sort of stuff. But it was the English system of law was imposed on the country from the 1600s onwards. Prior to that, there'd been a very extensive system of the Brehon laws throughout the country.
I better get moving here because this Zoom session ends at 9 o'clock. So
okay.
Sorry, a few more questions here through. Just quickly, Rosaline mentions how, listen, yes, in every language there are dialects. Ireland is no different to that. I'm sure any language that is spoken. Patrick says here, was there uniform Irish before the collapse of the language? No. The different dialects. And he noted that Irish in the north, and probably was referring maybe more Ulster, is similar to Scottish Gaelic. There's a very close similarity between Scottish Gaelic and the Irish language. And then probably it's maybe emphasised a little bit more if you're comparing the Ulster dialect. Would I be right in saying that? Or Alan, Jared, would you have anything to add there?
No, I think. No. Sorry, Alan, go ahead.
No, I was just going to agree generally, yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if you met somebody from North Antrim, their English is very, very close to the Scottish. Very close. So the Irish that would have been spoken around about then would be similar. But I mean, if you're talking about Irish in South Armagh, there's very, very little correlation between that and Scottish Gaelic.
Alan mentions here that Brian Frail's play Translations, this is actually a good comment, deals with Irish and hedge schools in the 1830s as national schools are introduced. Rosie, I'm just trying to go through. Sorry, Seamus put in a very good comment. I shouldn't laugh, but he went to the Gaeltacht. Sorry, apologies. Seamus went to the Gaeltacht 60 years ago. Sorry, Seamus says here he went to Gaeltacht 60 years ago. He learned a lot, even some Irish. Seamus, I would say you're not the only one who goes to the Gaeltacht and learns a lot, not only Irish, to be honest. Sorry, I had to get the giggles because the stories I've been told when people go to the Gaeltacht, they do have the best crack. And for those who aren't, I'm sure most people know when we say crack in Ireland, it's fun, humour, not illegal substances. Patrick in Kentucky says he enjoyed the presentation. Always enjoys listening to the people speaking the Irish when he's in Ireland. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to, is there anything here? Someone mentions here there's only one Gaelic school in Glasgow. So that shows how language is at risk when a city the size of Glasgow only has one Gaelic school. I'm presuming that's like a all Gaelic school. Yes, Audrey mentions France and Germany have imposed standard language rules for ages. I suppose that makes, again, a sense to try and protect a language.
Yeah, well, France is interesting because it's of that book, Peasants to Frenchmen. So before Napoleon, there was lots of linguistic diversity in France, and Napoleon just got rid of it as part of big state building project quite successfully, just to get rid of lots of all the local languages and build a, very efficient military machine and the state, and no one had really thought of that before on that scale,
Jerry mentions here that in Northern Ireland, in his era, in the 60s, if you didn't pass 11 plus, you didn't go to grammar school, you didn't get the opportunity to learn Irish. That's supposed to be recognised too. The education systems in Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland are very different, and the availability of learning Irish has improved dramatically in Northern Ireland to it was in previous years. Very, very few high schools in Northern Ireland at the time offered the opportunity.
Yeah, we were applying for primary schools in Northern Ireland, and one of the ones we had considered was a Gael school that's nearest that's good, and you have to put in your not only with your application information about where you live, are you in the catchment area, but you had to put in a little section on your interest in the Irish language. And my wife had a big spiel. She's good at Irish and she's done lots of things and she speaks it regularly in some circumstances. But after this big long spiel, I just had one line. It's like, father was educated to Leaving Cert Standard. Mother, this big long thing, and father educated to Leaving Cert Standard. Yeah.
Maureen mentions here that this reflects what happened here. Obviously, Maureen's from New Zealand. What happened in New Zealand with the Maori language in the 19th century. The language revival really started in the 1970s and it's becoming more used in the media and as an everyday language. And more people are doing classes. Immersion schooling has greatly helped. I think it comes back to that where people have a passion and want to learn it, to use it, to keep it alive, isn't it?
Alan, I'm just wondering, just thinking here, translations was mentioned. There's Brian Free's play, and I'm
Yeah.
just wondering if there's a correlation between the establishment of the National System of Education 1831 and the first Ordnance Survey maps 1834-35. In terms of the anglicisation, and that translations deals with the loss of the micro townlands and the homogenisation into larger townlands, which we know today. I mean, there were a huge amount of townlands which were modified. I mean, is there any correlation, do you reckon, between those?
They probably fit under the kind of broad umbrella of the state reaching in and, becoming more prevalent in people's lives, where the state had never thought of going in because they wanted to tax people and have more influence and sway. So I don't know, but I wouldn't I definitely wouldn't rule that out. How you would, so it's like the econometrician in me, you always have to think how you'd operationalize these things, and I'm not particularly good thinking on my feet right now. So
no,
let me take. Yeah. That's a good point.
I remember doing some work on Leitrim in the 1830s and 1840s, and it was to do with it was threatening notices, and it was a tax on houses and all that sort of stuff. And actually, the constabulary was lamenting the fact that the houses that they wanted to get to apprehend suspects, they said they couldn't go through them. They were bad enough during the day, but you don't think about it at night, And one of the things then post-famine was the emergence of roads through those bogs. So then it allowed, and up mountainside, so that it allowed previously inaccessible areas to be accessible by the state, the police and the British Army, etc. So I mean, it's interesting that the motive behind the emergence of the likes of the railways or the roads or whatever, alongside, of course, the decline of the language consequent upon it.
Kathleen, I'm not sure if anybody can comment on this. This is quite specific to a particular university. Kathleen in this upstate New York mentions, I know that's a requirement at the University of Galway to speak no Irish. I presume maybe it's to be in employment there. I'm not sure.
Yeah, you do need to speak Irish to work there.
Is that? And she's asked, how long has that been a requirement? And do other universities now? Galway, its position is in the kind of Gaeltacht environment. There's some strong Gaeltacht areas in the Galway catchment. So I can see how, to an extent, there's a requirement. Do other universities in the Republic, Alan, require that?
The only one I've heard about is Galway.
Yeah,
and the reason I know is because I was talking to someone there, and they said their wife was going for an admin job, and part of the process was her getting out the books, and felt like
I can see definitely, because it's geographical location, to Gaeltacht without a doubt. Now, there's a variety of jobs in the Republic where you have to have a certain standard of Irish.
Yeah, primary school teachers.
I think does it still exist that to be a librarian you had at one stage, until certainly recently you had to have a certain standard of Irish.
I should know that. I don't know.
There's probably a variety of professions too, outside just of Galway University. But yeah, I actually didn't realize that myself. But now thinking about it, that makes sense to me, actually. Because they're very strong in trying to keep the language alive in that part of the island. Elizabeth says, for juice to Elizabeth, she says, never mind us speaking Irish. Our teachers could hardly speak it. Sorry. Yeah, you have to need a bit of humor, because this is it. It depends how well at times they were taught. But in some schools, I do recall some teachers are very good at interacting with one another in Irish. Probably help keep their proficiency up. Maureen says, thank you very much, Alan, for your fascinating presentation. Very interesting to see my mother's area having a strength in Irish in the early mid-19th century. That was the Cavan Leitrim border. Yeah, on one of your maps, I saw a bit of a pocket there up towards like West Cavan Dowra area.
Yeah.
Yeah, it must have been a bit of this kind of a strong Irish speaking area just there at one stage.
Yeah.
Other areas. Am I right? I can't remember when exactly, but I just saw the colour. Thought I just remember that. Yeah, kind of west of Black Line, more
Well,
more
actually,
like Dara.
guys, that Sean McDermott, who was executed in 1916, he cycled to Tullamore near Dara to learn Irish.
There you go.
Yeah.
That just
Yeah, so
because Dara,
that just rings a
just in
bell.
the
Yeah,
that's at West Cavan. Um, Lovely part of the country, beautiful, beautiful landscape. Um, okay, sorry. My grandfather. Okay, sorry. I've just suddenly lost me. Where am I? Rosine mentioned here her grandfather's parish, County Monaghan. There were 130 town lands in 1830s and halved by the 1850s. I'm not sure what that means now. Not sure. Eamon says the translation from Irish place names to English versions is fascinating. Yeah,
uh-huh.
again, it shows how a language can be lost too
Uh-huh.
when places have been anglicized.
Uh-huh.
Um, I think I've nearly covered hopefully everything
Guilty.
there. Did I miss anything? But this is it. You don't know your town land.
No.
I've inquired, but yeah, but I just saw because I know growing
Well,
up in the
a lot
country.
of people around me in Belfast don't know the county they're in. So,
But
because of the Down Antrim, it's understandable because you've got the Lagan River, and
yeah,
that's we're Antrim side. But like going over to from Stranmillis to Ormo is you're crossing county boundaries.
yeah.
But a lot of people you say that to and they don't
I,
realize it.
I did say the county thing really isn't important for them of it, where I suppose
Yeah,
I've always from my suppose mindset of where I came from was very much you're kind of like your town land, your kind of your parish, your county, your province,
yeah. I think it goes
Um,
a bit with urbanization, though.
yeah.
I
And
mean,
as
when
you
I never knew my townland growing up, but I just grew up in suburban Dublin,
yeah,
so
yeah.
um, it's a
Actually, I remember.
I'm from a made up place anyway,
All right.
a nowhere made up place. Yeah.
Sorry, Jared, what were you going to say there?
No, no. I remember buying a house out near a place in near Downpatrick, and it was on the Lockmoney Road, and the town land was Lockmoney, but the name of the ground on which the house was Church Walls, and it wasn't on any map. And I remember just sending an envelope to it to see if it would get to it, and I just put Church Walls Downpatrick on it, and it got there. And that was a name that was nothing to do with the house or anything like that, but it was like a sub denomination. Some of the things were actually wiped out in the 1830s with the Ordnance Survey, and it was still there, obviously passed down from generation to generation. So that will go on. And of course, it goes down to, where on farms, you had the fields were actually named.
Yeah,
You would have had the
yeah,
spring meadow, you would have had,
yeah.
etc. The fort, the Gargine, I'm thinking
Or
of places
even
very different.
our names after the farm my mother grew up on. There was a field and it's called the Rudy Cam.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And I always think very kind of like just wonder what actually the name came from,
Yes,
what it means,
yes.
But
Yeah.
Jared, you mentioned here, Eamon's asking, so that the country thing, he obviously means the creation of sorry, not country thing, the creation of counties
Mm.
was an English introduction to
Mm.
Ireland, yes?
1600s. Yep.
Okay.
And actually, ironically, it's been kept alive probably to the greatest extent by the GAA
Yeah.
because your loyalties are very much on your county basis, So yeah, very much so from the 1600s. Well, from the late 1500s onwards, actually. You had Laois, which was Queen's County, you had Offaly, which was King's County, and then the emergence into the 1600s with the plantation, as it's referred to, the plantation of Ulster. You had all the various counties, and they're so unnatural, as I made the point before. North Armagh, South Armagh, completely different areas, but within the same county. North Leitrim, South Leitrim, again, completely different geographical areas, nothing in common, but that's the way the lines were drawn in around where the tribes were, the O'Rourke's of Breffni. Cavan, parts of Cavan had much more in common with parts of Leitrim, obviously. Breffni, O'Rourke, East, Breffni, West, so eventually they morphed into counties, the 32 counties that we have today.
Just Rosie mentions again how she heard her previous comment about town land. She mentioned that obviously the rationalising and standardising town lands that in the area she mentioned earlier they'd halved post the famine. I think we've covered. Just got plenty of good questions there. Everybody was really engaged. Thank you everyone for their input. Do you have anything else to add, George, before we
Nope,
finish up this evening?
I have said more than enough. Yes, I think that's plenty. Yeah, I think it's interesting that the language reaches into the deepest crevices of Irish society, whether it be place names, the townlands, which is so important, right up into the family names, the surnames, and then you're looking at the macro level with the decline of the language throughout the country. But as I said, Alan, it would be fascinating to see, if there was a correlation between the easing of the penal laws in the 1760s right through, as you say, but it's trying to find the data for that, and also looking at you can only use maybe name information as I referenced there, the indictment books from County Armagh 1715, but it'll be interesting to see the decline of the language between 1700 and 1800 as a prelude to what was happening. And as Alan said, it's 2, 3, 4 generations down the line that you actually see the results of what was planted in that earlier period.
So that really brings our lecture tonight to a close. Thank you everybody for your input, and Alan, thank you for delivering your talk. It's been much appreciated.
Thanks, Dolores. Thanks, Jared. Thanks to all
Thank
the
you,
commentators. They're brilliant.